Namaste. Welcome to Vishwa Yoga. My name is Vishwa. Today I will talk about the origin of Tantric practices and connect them to their lineage and masters. These Tantric practices can be said as the play of Shiva and Shakti, consciousness and the power of the consciousness. Each of us is a miniature of the same Shiva and Shakti. Many people ask this question and are interested to know more about left-hand path practices such as sexual practices and magic practices. So in this video, I will go one step further so that you will have a better understanding of how these practices began or evolved. It may appear an extension of the previous video. So let's start. If you recall, in my previous videos, I had divided Tantric practices into 4 major groups, just for the simplicity. Common practices, yoga practices, sexual practices, and power practices. I suggest you to watch them. I will add their link in this video. But to find the origin of different kind of practices, I will have to go back to Shaiva Tantra again. If you remember the Shaiva Tantra video, there are 2 paths in Shaiva Tantra, mantra path and extreme path. In mantra path, there are 2 major schools, Shaiva Siddhanta and Kashmir Shaivism, or Siddhanta and Non-Siddhanta. Both schools started in North India. They use common terms and the same triads, but have different philosophical approaches. After the Muslim invasion, Siddhanta tradition gradually moved to South India, and today majority of its followers are there. However, the practitioners of Kashmir Shaivism is comparatively very less, but due to non-orthodoxy, they can be found across the world and especially in the Western world from different ethnicity and culture. Both schools claim to be supreme based on their philosophical arguments. But let me share some of the big differences and contributions to the Tantric practices. The Shaiva Siddhanta is mostly an orthodox Tantric tradition, uses rules and restrictions of purity and impurity, caste system as suggested in Vedic text. But many of the core elements of Tantric practices, including ritual and doctrine, originated in this tradition. For example, Tantric forms of yoga and the associated subtle body, nadi, chakras, kundalini, etc. It is said that in this tradition, the structure of the 36 tattvas was first codified. Siddhanta means doctrine that follows orthodox right-hand path, or simply Siddhanta. In summary, Shaiva Siddhanta contributed a lot to the right-hand path of common practices and yoga practices. Now, on the other side, Kashmir Shaivism is a non-Siddhanta tradition, a non-orthodox system based on Bhairava agamas, more flexible and open to all. I covered the fundamentals of Kashmir Shaivism in the previous video. This tradition has contributed to both right-hand path and left-hand path practices. The scriptures of this system are divided into 2 groups. One dedicated to the higher form of Shiva as Bhairava, or masculine principle, and the other group of scriptures divided into various forms of Divine Mother or Shakti as Bhairavi or feminine principle, thus created 2 groups within this non-dualistic mantra path based on the type of energy. The mantras dedicated to masculine energy are continued to refer to as the mantra, but the mantras with feminine energy are referred to as Vidya. In Shaivism, Vidya path also include Kula methods or practices, which I will describe it little later. Practices of Kashmir Shaivism were developed for private practices, but practices of Shaiva Siddhanta were mostly developed as public-facing practices, such as temple practices, festivals, and rituals. In the same way, the majority of Vaishnava tradition and its practices are orthodox and has greatly contributed to the right-hand path practices. One tiny school of Vaishnava follows the left-hand path and is hardly known to anyone, but it is said that their practices are borrowed from Kashmir Shaivism. As you might guess, orthodox schools consider left-hand path practices as inferior ones. However, some masters describe that these two systems are not opposed to each other. Rather, one is samanya or for regular people, and another one is a vishesh for extraordinary people. As you can see how these schools contributed to right-hand path practices such as common practices including rituals, temple construction, deity worship, festivals, puja practices, and tantric yoga practices. Most teachers can explain them in detail, but now let me share about the origin of non-orthodox left-hand path practice. Many people are interested to know about these practices, but usually find misleading and confusing information which lacks the clarity and validity of scriptural sources. Most teachers from orthodox tradition avoid talking about it because of their conditioning, even though it is part of the ancient scriptures. And that's the reason even majority of Indians are not even introduced or exposed to their own scriptures and brilliant masters that they existed and work they did, and later distorted information they get to know from other sources. So let's see how left-hand path practices evolved. Please keep in mind that the tantric practices have three essential elements: tantra as a system, mantra, and yantra. In some practices, our body is used as the yantra. Our body is the vehicle of consciousness. Though the left-hand path practices are more visible in Kashmir Shaivism and extreme path schools of Shaivism. So let's revisit Kashmir Shaivism. I assume that you have already watched my previous video on Kashmir Shaivism, but I will share a quick summary here. It is said that at the beginning of the present era, Kali Yuga, around 5,000 years ago, sage Durvasa received the direct revelation of Shaiva tradition or Shaiva Tantra from Lord Shiva on Mount Kailas. He created 3 mind-born sons and a daughter. He initiated each son into respective Shaiva agmas, and the daughter named Ardhatrembaka into Shakta Tantra, and then he disappeared. As time passed, the knowledge started to gradually disappear. Later, around 800 AD, Vasugupta received the revelation of Shiva Sutra, which became the foundation of Kashmir Shaivism. In this system, there are 4 major schools, in which 3 of them emphasize the power of Shiva called Shakti. The 4th one is a philosophical school. So those schools emphasizing Shakti became the foundation of Shakta Tantra. Now let me elaborate on these schools from Shakti's point of view, including unorthodox practices, because Shakti is the door to Shiva. So the first one is Krama. Historically, Krama school is one of the oldest Tantric Shakta schools, which existed even before Kashmir Shaivism was formally developed, most likely in the lineage of sage Durvasa's mind-born daughter Ardhatrembaka. As time passed, the system got veiled. It is said that later, around 900 AD, Master Jnananetra was directly initiated by goddess Mangala Kali in the cremation ground. Initially, this system was predominantly given to women, thus had 3 female disciples, Keruvati, Madanika and Kalyanika. Ma Keruvati is said to be the first female Siddha and Tantric guru in this tradition. Later, both males and females got initiated in this tradition. One of her direct disciples was Harshvanath in the 10th century, who revolutionized the classical yoga into life-affirming Tantric yoga practice. In his text, Subodho Dayamanjari, he says, direct your awareness during the peak moment of climax in lovemaking to the point between the genitals and the navel. As the blissful pulsation of orgasm fade, freedom from suffering and enlightenment can be attained. This school is based on the worship of goddess Kali and thus belongs to Kali Kula. It includes cremation ground practices, offering meat and sacrifices, uses of skulls and dead bodies such as Panchmundi sadhana and Shaiva sadhana, etc. On the other side, Krama school has contributed a lot to the knowledge of prana, chakra, and kundalini yoga practices. The great master Abhinav Gupta received his initiation into the Krama system from his master Bhutiraj. Next is the most famous school, Kula, very ancient school as described by Abhinav Gupta. It has 4 major gurus based on each yuga. In the present era of Kali Yuga, Sri Machandranath, or formerly known as the Great Siddha Matsyendranath, introduced Kula Tantra around the 5th century. This knowledge was transmitted to him by divine yoginis or forms of Shakti. It also includes the practices based on Brahmayamal text or union tradition, deals with ritualized sexual practices, use of sexual fluids, intercourse, spirits, and cremation ground rituals. This school is also influenced by Atimarg or extreme path, also called Soma Siddhantins or Kapalika tradition. He had 6 sons who propagated 6 different Kula systems. Some text states that a group of female spirits known as yogini who can grant magical powers and secret knowledge, thus also known as Yogini Kula and Siddha Kula. But as time passed, practices started to get distorted. Later in 9th century, Sumatinath again introduced this system, modified and refined the practices to suit the need of the time. In this lineage, it was handed down to great master Abhinav Gupta by his most favorite master or teacher Sambhunath. Abhinav Gupta further refined this system to make it more suitable and accessible for householders. The story says that Siddha Matsyendranath received the knowledge of Hatha Yoga directly in his mother's womb from Adinath, Lord Shiva, when he was sharing this knowledge with Divine Mother. He is also attributed for Nath Kula, which was for householders in the beginning. But later in this lineage, great Siddha Gorakhnath further propagated the Nath sect and refined it to make it more suitable for the ascetics. He is also known for his great contribution to Hatha Yoga tradition and a Nath tradition. Nath tradition still exists in India today. And in this lineage, further down the line, the great master Swatmarama wrote the foundational text on Hatha Yoga called Hatha Yoga Pradipika. Today, Hatha Yoga is popularly known as yoga and practiced under different brand names around the world. If you read carefully, this Hatha Yoga text mentions some of the sexual practices for advanced practitioners. Though they are hardly ever taught by modern masters, as most of them come from orthodox lineage or background. All these tantric practices, either left or right, have one thing in common, and that is Kundalini. And Hatha Yoga acts as the foundation in Tantra Yoga, leading to Laya Yoga and Raj Yoga. The third school is Spanda, which emphasizes Shakti and is the foundational school of Kashmir Shaivism. It acknowledges both right hand and left hand path practices. Acknowledging three goddesses, each one is depicted on the trident of Shiva, and suggests three methods of practices that I have already mentioned in the previous video. Around 800 AD, Vasugupta received the revelation of Shiva Sutra, which became the foundation of Spanda school. The practices of Spanda school includes pranayama or breath work, concentration on different parts of the body, contemplation or dharana, recitation, mantras, and various meditation techniques for all levels of practitioners. This is a very practical school, and one should ideally begin the journey here. Great Master Bhatendu Raja initiated Abhinav Gupta in Spanda school. The fourth school is Prativigya, emphasizes Shiva. This school was started by Somananda, a disciple of Vasugupta, to crystallize the philosophy. Abhinav Gupta was initiated into this system by Lakshman Gupta. Abhinav Gupta learned from many masters, said to have 12 different gurus, thus received initiation in many different systems, including the dualistic Shaivism. Here I have only provided or mentioned just few of them. He was primarily a Kula practitioner, but churned all the knowledge coming from different schools, which is visible in his writing. He was the founder of Trika or threefold system, which unified these four major schools into one, and that is known as Kashmir Shaivism. Now moving to extreme path or Ati Marg schools. One of the schools is called Aghora. Their roots are in also Kapalika schools. Kapalika school formally does not exist anymore, but many schools borrow their old methods. The Aghora practices are also known as dark practices, and followers are called Aghoris, primarily dedicated to Shiva, as Shiva was the first Aghori. But Aghoris also perform the Shakta practices or Mahavidya sadhanas. Aghoris consider sage Dattatreya as their Siddha or the predecessor of this tantric tradition. But please keep in mind that in many non-dualistic tantric traditions, sage Dattatreya is linked and revered. You will also find him in Sri Vidya tradition. He was a son of Vedic sages Atri and Ma Anasuya. The exact time of his birth is unknown, but sage Durvasa is said to be his brother, and he was born in Kashmir region. Another left-hand path system that is hardly known to most people is called Chaturbhagini or four sisters. This tradition worshipped four sisters or goddesses of the four directions. Jaya representing east, whose vehicle is corpse. Vijaya representing south, mounted on the owl. Jayanti representing west, visualized riding a horse. And Aparajita representing north, who rode in flying chariot. They are worshipped along with their brother, the four-faced Tumburu, an embodiment of Shiva. the four goddesses were appeased for success in battle or love. Tumburu has associations with healing, protection, and sovereignty. These practices are based on mantras, but also include violence, sexual congress, etc. The only surviving text of this tradition is Vinasika Tantra. To summarize, most of the common and yogic practices are based on Agama scriptures. The sexual practices and some power practices of Tantra are linked to the Yamal text, the oldest Tantric texts such as Brahm Yamal, Rudra Yamal, etc. Yamal means couple. It consists of sexual practices, magic practices, and cremation ground practices, including mantras. Magic and spirit practices, including Sabar mantras, which are in local dialects, are linked to Dhamma texts. Though Kula Tantra includes both right hand and left hand path practices, but 70% of the Kula practices are left hand path practices, and mantra is used in all kind of practices. Now, returning to the Kashmir Shaivism of Abhinav Gupta for Shakta Tantra. If you have watched my previous video on Shakta Tantra, there are four major original traditions called Amanyas or Kula that existed based on four directions and started from Kashmir Shaivism. Here, the word Kula refers to tradition as well as the group or family. Though these Amanyas have changed over time, these traditions spread out from Kashmir to different parts of India and beyond. The Eastern tradition is associated with the Trika system. Western tradition is now limited to Nepal region only. The Northern tradition is called Kali Kula, which includes the Krama system as well, and the Southern tradition is dedicated to the most beautiful goddess Sri Lalita, called Sri Kula, which I will be covering in the next video. Thus, Sri Kula and Kali Kula are the two main schools of Shakta Tantra, which are branched out from Shaiva Tantra. However, it is also important to mention that there is another ancient and surviving practice of Shakta tradition called Durga Kula. Every year, Durga Puja and Navaratri festivals are celebrated, and in which 9 forms of Durga are worshipped, especially in the eastern part of India. The same Ma Durga transforms into Mahakali, Mahalakshmi, and Mahasaraswati. Durga's mantra, Krama, can be invoked in either Sri Kula or Kali Kula. Just to make it more clear that those schools' name with the word Kula can be very confusing, it primarily refers to the group of goddesses along with their chief deity called Kula Devi. Now, within each Kula of Shakta Tantra, you can do the practice using the process and steps of either Vidya Tantra or Kula Tantra. Vidya Tantra uses mantra yoga practices, and Kula Tantra uses Kula methods for practices, which also include mantra. Each school has multiple lineage and its own set of practices, and may follow methods of either right hand path, left hand path, or middle path, which I have already talked about it in the previous videos. Traditionally, the right hand path through mantra or Vidya path is always the starting point for any school. Each school has 3 levels of practices: beginners, intermediate, and advanced. However, as you progress beyond the beginners level, you must qualify to do the practices under the guidance of a qualified guru. The qualification or criteria are mentioned in Abhinav Gupta's for Kula path. But if you are not fully prepared or qualified for advanced practices of Kula, and you ignored the warning and recklessly tried those practices, your spiritual progress may be doomed prematurely. As the scripture says that you will become yogini grasa, which means such efforts will be shunned by the yoginis or disqualify you forever. Only a qualified guru can guide or intervene. They are the same yogini who bestow the secret knowledge or siddhis or accomplishments. That's why the left-hand path is called Rajarsha path. However, you may ask a question that some teachers, especially in the West, teaching sexual practices to beginners, what about them? The short answer is, based on my experience, that those teachings are based on the beginner's level of sexual practices of the Kula system, along with other methodologies incorporated or borrowed from different systems for today's time and need. But keep in mind that the sexual practices are just one of the Kula school practices. Each type of practices has different levels and purposes. Like how yoga and meditation is used as an application for physical, mental, and emotional well-being today. In the same way, sexual practices of Tantra are used for healing, more love and pleasure, and creating a more harmonious and satisfying relationship. Many men and women have trauma, sexual issues. Some are not even aware of it. If aware, then they either don't want to accept or are stuck in a pattern or orthodox thinking or conditioning, as it has never been taught to us in our modern but orthodox society. The bottom line is, these practices prepare the body and mind to connect to ourself and ignite the Shakti within. Similar to yoga practices, there are intermediate and advanced Kula Tantra practices. But today, in my experience, most people who come to yoga or Tantra classes primarily looking for overall well-being. Many started due to some kind of pain or issue. So majority of them are not looking for intermediate and advanced practices leading to enlightenment. If desired so, then one must meet certain requirements first to be accepted by a qualified master for that level. So this was the high-level information on the origin of tantric practices. I have tried to cut down the complications to keep it simple for easier understanding. Hope it may have answered some of your questions. In my next video, I will talk about the Sri Vidya school of Shakta Tantra. Thank you for watching and have a wonderful day. Namaste. Thank you so much for listening. If you like the information, please subscribe, like, and share so that everyone else can also enjoy this.